Be joined in the studio by Larry Sanders, a brother of US Senator and former Democratic presidential primary contender Bernie Sanders. He himself has been a Green Party councillor in England, just told me he's lived here for 55 years, nearly as long as me. Greg Swenson is chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Elisabeth Braw is senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. She's the author of the book Goodbye Globalisation, The Return of a Divided World. And Tom Rivers is a broadcaster and journalist who's a former London Correspondent for the American network ABC News. That's all coming up in a moment. We'd love to get your questions on 0345 6060 973 and do watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Kamala Harris says her campaign's finished with optimism and energy as millions vote in the US presidential election. Republican Donald Trump says he's feeling very confident of returning to the White House. Hal Lambert, a Republican donor who served on Donald Trump's inaugural committee in 2016, told LBC we could have a result tonight.
Pennsylvania's the one to watch tonight. I think Trump wins Georgia and North Carolina. If he wins Pennsylvania, it's pretty much over at that point. So Pennsylvania's the key one. And the Dems are down significantly, up to 600,000 to 800,000 fewer Democrat voters this time at the same time as they were in 2020.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's fired his defence minister. He says there have been significant gaps and a crisis of trust between him and Yoav Gallant. The father of Sarah Sharif has denied physically abusing and killing his daughter. Irfan Sharif is on trial accused of murdering the 10-year-old in Surrey last August. Planned strikes by drivers on the London Underground have been suspended. Members of the ASLEF union were due to walk out on Thursday and Tuesday in a dispute over pay. And the Queen's been told to rest after coming down with a chest infection. She's been forced to withdraw from royal engagements this week. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 11 points at 81.72. The pound buys $1.30 and €1.19. LBC weather, patchy rain in the northwest tonight, mist and fog also developing, and a low of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. Welcome to the show. It's Tuesday's Cross Question. With me on the panel are Larry Sanders, brother of US Senator and former Democratic presidential primary contender Bernie Sanders. Greg Swenson, chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Next to him, Elisabeth Braw, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. And Tom Rivers, broadcaster and journalist, who's the former London correspondent for the American network ABC News. They are here to answer your questions. Do give us a call on 0345 6060 973. And as we're talking, Americans are going to the polls, so we'll take questions predominantly on the US election, but if you have other burning issues, feel free to phone in about those too. And of course, as ever, you can watch us live on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's start off with a text question from Carl in Horsham. Donald Trump said earlier that immigration and the Mexican border has been the defining issue of this election. Is he right? Well, he was speaking to reporters after voting in Palm Beach, Florida, and said that he thinks the border has been the biggest issue, followed possibly by inflation. America's inflation rate has now fallen to 2.1%, just 0.1% above the Federal Reserve's target. Britain's inflation rate is now below 2%. Well, Greg Swenson from Republicans Overseas UK, is Trump right?
Slightly. Those are the top two issues.
That makes progress.
But but the number one issue, at least according to the polling, is inflation and the economy. Mm-hmm. And number two is the crisis at the border and the humanitarian crisis associated with it. So, yeah, I mean, he's mostly right.
What does it say, though, about this election, if he is right, that issue has defined everything? I mean, it was obviously a big issue in the UK election too, but probably not the overwhelming one.
Yeah, I mean, part of it's just the polling, right? I mean, it might not be the biggest issue for certain people, and it's surely, from someone living abroad, I'm not really directly affected by the border crisis and the fentanyl and the crime associated with the illegal migrants, but I follow this stuff, so of course I'm quite aware of it. But same with inflation. Inflation only hurts the really, the working class, the people in the bottom quartile or even the bottom half of income earners. And so, you can be, a little bit separated from that and not really get it. And I notice, a lot of the people that were advocating for Joe Biden and now for Kamala, they're not really affected by inflation and the cost of living crisis as well as the border crisis, because for the most part, you don't see a lot of migrants in Martha's Vineyard or in Georgetown or in the Upper East Side. I mean, although the Upper East Side is probably affected a bit more, but these are things that affect most Americans, maybe not the people who opine on these things.
Elisabeth Braw.
I think if we were to look at the weight of various issues facing the US, climate change would probably be the top issue, simply because it has a tremendous effect that can't be reversed. But of course, it comes down to what people perceive to be the most important issue, not what really is the most important issue. And Trump has been successful in making migration or illegal immigration an incredibly powerful issue in this campaign. One should remember that on his instruction, Republican lawmakers in Congress voted against the reform bill that President Biden had put forward, and so perpetuated this issue at the border. So you can say that he has helped make it the most important issue, even though it didn't need to be the most important issue.
I think it was an issue before he got into the campaign this time around, and of course, on a lot of those things, that bill was really flawed. It only meant closing the border at 5,000 a day. That's 1.8 million a year. Barack Obama's Homeland Security advisor, said at 1,000 a day is a crisis. So I think the bill had so many flaws. I'm not blaming Trump.
Larry Sanders.
Well, I think that this is a brilliant example of Trump as a brilliant politician, brilliant and totally destructive. The immigrants, those 11 million or whatever people are living and working in the United States, are enormously important to the economy. They're probably mostly very good people, the way the rest of us are, and to make them into the boogeyman.
Well, according to Trump, they're very bad people.
Well, according to Trump is a liar, and he's a brute, and he's building up tremendous hatred. That's really what worries me. First of all, he's going to have troops, he says. I hope he can succeed, locking up and deporting millions of people. Can you imagine what that's going to be like? Thousands of troops on the streets, armed guards with people who are embedded in their communities. And of course, the final thing is, if you really want to be destructive and murderous, what you can do is get your population to hate a particular part of its population. We've lived through that and died through that. And this is where Trump is not just another conservative politician. This is Trump, a brilliant politician, a totally destructive human being.
Let me play devil's advocate, because every country has a right to control its own borders and not allow in people who may want to come to the country, but they've got no legal basis of being there. What is wrong with controlling borders?
There's nothing wrong with controlling borders. You just have to have rules, and you have to have a way of people getting a chance to make their case, and all the rest of it. Walls and the rest of it is irrelevant. Yes, they can control their borders, but the other thing is, what rules you make. If you need workers, which the United States does, and if you haven't made them into horror stories, then you welcome them. And you say, yes, this year we don't take that many. Next year we could take more for this particular area, whatever. You can make rational rules, but what you don't do is go to war against your own people who are living in your own country.
Okay. Tom Rivers.
It's interesting. You think back to our grandparents. In my case, I don't know about you, Greg, or
definitely,
you, Larry, but they came in legally. They went through Ellis Island. They went through all of the paperwork. They did it properly. They came from Slovenia. They came from Serbia, in my case, the mines of northeastern Minnesota. They did it properly. They don't want to see, according to Trump, 15 million people just rocking up and crossing the border. They're fed up with that. These are the people that are voting for Trump today that say, I have been left behind. We played by the rules. Next generation did better. The third generation did better. This is not what they did. This is not the procedure they went through, and they're fed up to their eye teeth seeing exactly what's happening down in Texas.
What about Trump's rhetoric? Because, I mean, Larry is right. It is very destructive rhetoric. It pitches people against each other. It's meant to create enemies of immigrants, isn't it?
Well, if you come in, if you have a proper procedure, there is not a problem. If you just, where do you want to live tomorrow? You want to live in Sweden? Just hop over there and just live there. Is that what you're advocating?
No, I'm not advocating anything. All I'm pointing out is that his rhetoric, the language that he uses, is not conducive to proper political debate because it is incendiary and creates divides where there don't need to be divides. Because everybody can unite. I mean, everybody on this panel, I'm sure, would agree that countries have rights to control their borders. Mm-hmm. But the rhetoric that he uses is just so incendiary.
I think that might be very reflective of a lot of the people in the Midwest that you probably have not encountered.
The politicians are there to lead, not follow, aren't they?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think he when he uses that kind of language, he's not standing out by himself. There is a legion of people that are behind him saying, "Yes, I fully support what you're doing."
Can I just bring in a similar story from another part of the world, and that is in Finland, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia and Belarus, respectively, are instrumentalizing migration as a tool of aggression against these countries. Essentially, they're trying to weaken Finland, Poland, Latvia and Lithuania by bringing migrants to the border who then cross over the border and are meant to destabilize these countries. And what these countries did without really very much debate at all is Finland just closed its border crossings. Poland and the other countries put up fences along the border, and it didn't become such a big political thing. It was just a pragmatic answer. So now we have a problem which is instrumentalized or weaponized migration, weaponized by Russia and Belarus respectively, and they just thought up a solution and then they did it, and it just wasn't a big thing. And I wonder why such pragmatic solutions are so elusive in America. And by the way, I'm somebody who has gone through over the years many visa application processes, and it is a pain. But there is, as you've all said, there is a way of entering the country legally. But I wonder, and I don't know the answer, and I would love to hear from you Americans here on the panel, why it is that other countries think up a pragmatic solution when they have a problem, whereas this has become just such a political issue that, for as long as I've lived in America, has divided the country, and now more than ever before.
It does seem so fixable, and I'm not saying Trump fixed it perfectly, so there was no illegal migration and only legal migration. But he got the numbers down significantly. Trump likes immigration, and Republicans and conservatives like immigration. But the people who got into the country the right way, like Hispanics in Arizona right now, 53% of Hispanics are for mass deportation in Arizona, the border state. Because what they're seeing is the destruction of their communities, the pain and suffering of the communities.
Oh, so you mean 53% support deportation?
Yeah.
I thought you meant 53% of them were up for deportation.
No.
That would be quite a task.
It's so it's interesting to see how well Trump is dealing with Hispanics and African Americans and other ethnic minorities. Kamala's numbers versus Hillary, Joe, and Barack are down significantly. So this message is not racist. This message, even though his language can be clumsy, but it's not racist. This is just practical. This is just common sense.
Larry, why do you think that is? Because it's the same here. You have a lot of immigrants who want to pull the drawbridge up after them.
Well, that's not new. somebody I was talking about our grandparents, and my father, in fact, was an immigrant. Up until 1924, the United States had pretty open immigration for decades. I don't know when it started. After 1920, after the First World War, there were Trump-type politicians. One did very well on an anti-immigrant policy, mainly anti-immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, which meant mainly Italians and Jews, actually, that we're trying to keep out. They succeeded. In the 30s, when my father was trying to bring his family out of Poland because they thought terrible things were likely to happen, the borders of the United States were closed. That's the victory of a right-wing movement.
But nobody wants to
and
close
they died
borders.
as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying that these Mexicans or whatever are going to be killed, but we know that there are big things happening. Can I add one more thing? Somebody talked about people being left behind. I think that the success of a Trump and other politicians, not Trump alone, in getting people so worked up about this is that a large chunk of Americans have been left behind. We have had 50 years of right-wing governments, Democrat and Republican. The average wage is about the same now, allowing for inflation, as it was 40 or 50 years ago. But why are those people not fed up? Of course they're fed up. They're very angry. But the answer that Trump gives them is, we have the answer. It's them bloody immigrants. They're eating dogs and cats. Well, she's starving to death. You need those dogs and cats. So, yes, it's very clever, very destructive.
I think you're right, Larry. I mean, in that regard, the cost of living is considerably higher today than we had maybe 4 years ago, and you're absolutely right. Income adjusted through inflation is about the same as it was in the mid-'70s. Nobody is getting a bigger chunk of the cake or the pie.
Somebody is.
But not probably anybody at this table. Somebody is. But the average Joe out there,
rich banker.
The average Joe, well, okay, but the average Joe is not. And yes, it does build up resentment, anger, left behind, play by the rules, and you don't get ahead or just jump in front of the line. So yes, it certainly is a factor, and I think he's his advisors certainly are dipping into the groundswell of feeling, and it is a raw nerve.
Right, we'll take more questions in just a moment. Some really good ones coming in. If you've got more questions, the number 0345 6060 973. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
The big painter.
Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
18 minutes past 8. With us on the panel tonight, Larry Sanders, Greg Swenson, Elisabeth Braw and Tom Rivers. Geraldine is in Barnet. Hello, Geraldine.
Hello.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
Given what is going on in Israel and Gaza and with Ukraine and Russia, who does the panel think will make the world safer?
Let's take a second call allied to that. Ash is in Notting Hill. Ash, what's your question?
Yeah, basically, we know the relation between Israel and Biden administration. It was a hit and miss. Sometimes they just, they just good together. Sometimes they don't want to, give the ground to each other. But what's the Trump or Camilla? Who's going to be best for the Middle East to bring the stability? And then what's going to happen to Iran if the Trump comes back in? Because they are scared of Trump to come back into the office. They really don't want Trump to be in the office as in the Islamic Republic, because he's going to be harsh. So what do you think of that? Thank you.
Elisabeth Braw from the Atlantic Council. I'm sure these are subjects that occupy your mind quite a lot.
They do. And Trump, I'm sorry to say, is the perfect example of somebody who doesn't know what he doesn't know. He doesn't like to read books. He is clearly not a foreign policy expert. That said, if you have spent a career in foreign policy, it doesn't mean that you're automatically well suited to be a successful foreign policy president. But if you look at somebody like Richard Nixon, who was a successful president in his foreign policy, he was truly interested in foreign policy and understood the nuances of foreign policy. And Trump is, I think, mentally not equipped to that sort of...
But people used to say that about Ronald Reagan, and yet looking back on his presidency, you'd say, well, actually his foreign policy and his security policy were absolutely outstanding. Generally, there were some exceptions. But because
he was solution-driven, whereas Trump is very much driven by anger and resentment vis-à-vis other countries, and that is not conducive to any sort of negotiation with any country that matters, let alone a positive outcome. And that's what I worry about. And what I worry about even more when it comes to Trump is the quality of his advisors. As we know, he went through a great number of advisors and cabinet members.
At 9:35, we're going to be speaking to one of them. Ambassador John Bolton will be on the programme. So
well,
stand by your beds for that one, ladies and gentlemen.
So he will not be returning if Trump wins. He will not be returning because he's one of the many advisors and ministers who were. So, are you saying that you think it would be difficult for him to recruit good people to his administration, and particularly on the foreign policy side? I mean, yes.
The former ambassador to Germany, whose name I now can't remember.
Richard Grenell.
That's the one. I saw him on Newsnight the other day, and he's tipped to be his Secretary of State, and I did think, God help us all.
God help us all. He was profoundly unsuccessful and as ambassador to Germany, not least because he had no interest in being a diplomat. He was there to rile the Germans up. And you can say, well, that's his right, and it is Trump's right to rile the Germans up. But in the state in which this world is at the moment, America needs to be looking for solutions, starting with its allies. But that's not to say that Kamala Harris will have a fantastic foreign policy team either. I think what afflicts foreign policy, American foreign and security policy in general, is the fact that so many people who are active in it have no experience living in any other country. And how can you understand how different the world looks like from other countries' perspectives if you have never lived anywhere except the United States? And this is what it has always been a problem, but it will be even more a problem when the world is in such a precarious state as it is today.
Tom Rivers.
I think it's chop and change. You talk about Ukraine. Kamala Harris says, well, carry on with the Biden policy. And that means carry on with throwing more money at Ukraine for as long as it takes until you go bankrupt in the West. And look at Germany today, last week, 3 Volkswagen plants, never closed before. The very engine of the EU is grinding down. Olaf Scholz, his party is number 3 in the popularity right now. So I think there would be a dramatic change with regard to Ukraine. Trump would say, let's try a diplomatic road. And don't poo-poo that. Some people here are old enough to remember the Paris peace talks in Vietnam. It is arduous, but you can go down that road, as opposed to saying, let's keep shoveling money at Ukraine.
But
the Middle East is
a brilliant mind like Henry Kissinger to be involved in such talks.
He was a wonderful globalist, if you want to go down that road.
But who is that person who can play that role?
I would have to see what his short list is. Middle East, different. We talked about that. Trump would be, again, more antagonistic to Iran, a different kettle of fish, chopping and changing. Talking about recently, the last couple of weeks, we had China. More exercises around Taiwan. You know, we get the same answers from Blinken. We get the same answers from Austin with regard to China, with regard to North Korea, with regard to Ukraine. There is a very, very different approach if, in fact, Trump can win. We'll have to wait and see. But again, otherwise, we're going to have the same policy that we've seen under Biden.
Larry.
Well, to some extent, I agree with that. I think the Biden policy towards Gaza has been awful. If I suppose everybody here has been looking at the photographs of all those children being mutilated, killed, orphaned, for a completely useless policy. Israel is under no threat from Gaza, from Hamas. They're a terrorist
Well, it was on the 7th of October 2023.
Well, they didn't keep their eye on the ball. Yes, you're right. It's a police problem, though. It's not a problem that's solved by bombing and starving tens and tens of thousands of people. Unfortunately, Trump is even worse. Trump has at least the Democrats seem to be in favor of feeding the people of Gaza. The Republicans are against even that, aid to feed the people. So I think Israel and Palestine and the things that are flowing from that are a terror story, and it's unlikely to improve. I know much less about the Ukraine, but I think there is some worry about letting a country like Russia take over another country and just stop opposing them. That doesn't seem to me an open and shut case.
Just on the Middle East,
yes,
it's very possible to argue that the Israeli-Arab situation was one of Trump's successes in his first administration.
Well, you could argue that,
the Abrahamic Accords would not have happened.
Yes.
Maybe, I would say possibly without Jared Kushner rather than Donald Trump, but it was under his administration that all happened.
Yes, but those were not good agreements. Those agreements
really?
said, yes, of course they were not good agreements. What they said is, we don't give a shit about, sorry about that, I'm getting Trumpish. We don't care about the Palestinians. We can make a deal with the Saudis or whoever. We let the Israelis have Jerusalem for a capital, let them assimilate the
But these were
Golan
agreements
Heights.
between Arab states and Israel, something that would have been unthinkable 5, 10, 15 years before.
Look, the problem is not the agreement between Israel and Arab states. The problem is that you have 14 million people in one small country, 7 million identifying as Jews, 7 million identifying as Palestinians. If you say to the Palestinians, we don't care. Let the Israelis do what they want to you. If they want to kill you, kill you. If they want to take over your land, take over your land. That is the heart of the problem, not the diplomatic relations are good or bad. In fact, they've had the relationships economically for decades. So the reality probably was very little different. The issue is Israel-Palestine. That cannot be solved. But in fact, my view is he made it much worse, because by telling the Palestinians that they were out of the picture, he probably emboldened or angered some of them.
Craig Swenson.
There's a long list here. I'll start with the Middle East. If you look back 4 years ago, this is another reason why people that might not like Trump, they do miss the peace and prosperity of his administration. So, for example, there was relative peace in the Middle East, not perfect. I'll agree with you, Larry. But I think that, the sanctions against Iran were quite effective at keeping the money away from the proxy groups, right? So Trump put the Houthis on the terrorist list. Biden came in, took the Houthis off the terrorist list. But Trump had the sanctions on Iran that were working. Biden came in, put $60 billion into the mullah's pocket. So, these are things that, whether you agree or not, there was peace, relative peace, I'm glad you brought up the Abraham Accords, which is a great moment. And to Elisabeth's point, nobody thought Trump was a foreign policy guy. I didn't think so either, and we were all sort of concerned or a bit worried about it. And funny enough, the foreign policy accomplishments were some of the best accomplishments of his administration. If you look at, his support for Ukraine, his handling of Iran, he put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. He doesn't do it diplomatically, okay? So we all know he's not a diplomat, and I agree with you, Elisabeth. But he does it in an aggressive way. But what he lectured the Germans about is exactly what Reagan lectured the Chancellor about in 1981 and warned them that you're going to be dependent on Russian natural gas in a decade. Well, it took 7 years, and they were. And Trump was just saying the same thing. You're dependent on Russian energy, you're making Putin rich, and you're not spending any money on defense. He had a point. And again, delivered it. Everybody was freaking out. The diplomatic crowd was freaking out. But he was right, and now we have 21 countries meeting their 2% obligation. The biggest concern for NATO and our European allies is not the amount of money that Poland is spending on GDP, on defense, 4%, good for them, congratulations, that is nice, it's great to see. But it's the fact that Germany is not meeting the target at all, and that's the biggest economy in Europe. And the U.S. has just cut defense spending 3 years in a row by 3% a year. It's now 2.9% of GDP. If Biden and Harris, or if Harris wins and continues the Biden strategy, it'll be 2.4%. That should worry Europeans, not Trump's mean tweets and his lack of diplomatic skills. So there's, and back to the people. A year ago, I was worried about that too. The thought process was all these guys like John Bolton are not going to come back and work for the president. And I think the president made some mistakes by hiring establishment people that didn't fit with the kind of new Republican brand. So it didn't work out with John Bolton. I understand that. I was shocked that he hired John Bolton because John Bolton was an establishment, inside the Beltway hawk, kind of pro-war in many ways. And one thing Trump is anti-war. He didn't start any wars. He doesn't like wars. And he does his best to use military strength, but targeted and temporary. You'll see guys like Mike Pompeo. They'll be back. I don't think Rick Grinnell could get a Senate confirmation, so I don't think he'll be the Secretary of State or Defense. But I think you'll see guys like Mike Pompeo back. So for every guy who's come out and said, Orange Man bad, there's a handful that have said, I'm back and I'm ready to serve. And there's a lot of them, and I know a lot of them.
Would it be a curveball, Greg, if some people have forwarded Tulsi Gabbard as maybe Secretary of State or Defense Secretary?
Wouldn't shock me.
Yeah.
She's lived overseas.
Yeah. Well, you remember, this was back about 2 years ago.
Just explain for our listeners who she is.
She was the Congresswoman from Hawaii, and she was the one 4 years ago in that debate with Harris and nailed her. Really nailed her. It was a knockout punch. Think back at that time, Harris didn't get a single Democratic delegate to support her in the primaries. But having said that, she's an interesting person. Many years in the reserves. Spent a number of tours in Iraq. I'm not sure about Afghanistan, but she's somebody to watch, according to some of the people on social media.
Well, we've mentioned Ambassador Bolton a couple of times. As I say, he'll be joining me live in an hour's time on LBC. More of your calls to come, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:32. Daryl Jackson has the LBC News headlines.
Donald Trump has cast his ballot in the US election as he told reporters he's very confident. Millions of voters are taking to the polls in the race between the former president and Kamala Harris. The Israeli Prime Minister has dismissed his popular Defence Minister Yoav Gallant in a surprise announcement. In a statement, Benjamin Netanyahu says trust has eroded between the two of them. And the Queen has a chest infection and has pulled out of engagements this week. Camilla is understood to be resting at home under doctors' supervision. LBC weather, patchy rain in the northwest tonight. Mist and fog also developing and a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35 on LBC. John in Godalming says, good on LBC, Trump propaganda. It's not propaganda when people give their own honest views about what's going on. I think over the course of the programme, we try and balance it out, and we'll continue for the following hour and 25 minutes before we finish. Let me reintroduce our panel to you. Tom Rivers is a broadcaster and journalist, former London correspondent for ABC News. Greg Swenson is chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Larry Sanders is brother of US Senator and former Democratic presidential primary contender Bernie Sanders, himself a former Green Party councillor in... where were you Green Party councillor? Oxfordshire. Was that a bit of a challenge?
That was an enormous challenge. There were two of us out of 70, so...
But you enjoyed it?
I enjoyed it very much, yes.
And Elisabeth Braw is here. Her book is called Goodbye Globalisation, The Return of a Divided World. 30-second elevator pitch for that.
It's about the rise and fall of globalization, starting in the late 80s and culminating around the Beijing Olympics, when there was one world, one dream, and on to where we are today, where globalization is definitely not in good shape, and told through the lives of various political leaders and business leaders. What a wild ride it has been, and let's see what comes after it.
And you're also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I can guess what the Atlantic Council is, but just explain that.
It's one of the large think tanks in Washington. As of this summer, I'm back in the UK, based in London, but I still have my job at the Atlantic Council. It's a
I'd like a job like that, flitting between London and Washington. That would be my dream. If you can fix that, that would be great. Right, let's go.
You can trade jobs for a week.
Oh, now there's an idea. Let's go to a text question from Chris in Brecon. Who does a large turnout favour in this election? Larry.
Well, I have to say, I haven't got a clue. I hope desperately that it means that Trump is on his way out. I think, yes, I think that we're within a few hours of knowing the answer.
Okay, great.
But it's who is turning out and where they're turning out.
That's a great point. I mean, if you just wanted to call it, I had to pick one answer on huge turnout. I just look back at 2020. Huge turnout favored Biden, but again, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're seeing a new mix of voters in the Republican Party and a new mix of voters in the Democrat Party. So if the sort of the elites, the college and educated and graduate degree, the rich on the coasts come out in big numbers, that favors Kamala. But she's already going to win New York, California, Washington, D.C. So. You know, but if you get a surge of voting in the rest of the country, that definitely helps Trump.
What about women voters? Because that seems to be a theme over the last week, that it could be women voters that win it for Kamala.
It could be, and one interesting theme that has emerged over the past few days is that married women in particular have essentially not told pollsters their true opinions. They've said one thing, namely that they'll vote for Trump, whereas in fact they may be planning to vote for Kamala Harris. And so we'll see how that turns out. But it's definitely the case this time that women will play a more significant role. And what's interesting, I think, Iain, is that in 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign made her campaign all about her being a woman. It was, in my opinion, a terrible mistake, because you vote for somebody because they have good policies. Mm-hmm. And this time it really is about the policies. You barely hear Kamala Harris mention that she is a woman, because it is about the policies, and in particular the policy that is expected to appeal to women, or to make them choose, likely to choose Kamala Harris is obviously the issue of abortion. But there is still a difference between women of a certain age and women of a younger age, but in general, it's seen as an issue where they will turn out for her. Interestingly, not because she's a woman, but because of the policy she represents.
And do you think the Trump sort of sex offending side, do you think that is going to have an effect on women's voting?
You know, I don't think so, and it's down to I think the process we have all gone through of becoming desensitized to whatever Trump does and says. 10 years ago, 9 years ago, any of the things that he says or does or has said or done throughout these 9 years would have shocked us. And now we're just so used to him being Trump that nothing really causes that shock effect anymore, including when he says that Haitians eat dogs or cats. It was headlines for a couple of days and then it went away.
Oh, that's just Donald being Donald. Tom Rivers.
Some of the reporting we see in London, I think, is very black and white. We know that women generally are going to be skewing more for Harris, and men are going to be skewing more for Trump. But just think about it. It's not that many years ago. Families sat around kitchen tables and said, "Look, are we going to cancel out our votes? Are we going to vote with my pals down at the office or the pals down at the plant?" Mm-hmm. That still goes on. And that nuance seems to be gone in a lot of the reportage this time around. Greg also brought up an interesting point about the changing allegiances. Look at the phenomenon of blue-collar work. Look at the Teamsters. Mm-hmm. The scrapper from Scranton thought he had them in his back pocket. Not anymore. They are not committed to either candidate this time. Where I grew up as a young...
big trade union.
Yeah, trade union. I grew up as a young kid. You grew up in northeastern Minnesota, you get a physical tap on the shoulder, as I did at 18, saying, "Tom, you want to be in the union." And that was, the DNA was Democrat. It was Democrat. The mayor from my town in Elisabeth 4 years ago, I don't know if Greg remembers, the second day at the GOP convention, said, "I'm breaking from tradition, and my pals in my town of now 3,000 people aren't going to believe this, but I'm supporting for the first time the GOP," which is like at that time buying a foreign car in that part of the world. It's almost like it's a kick in the shins. But yeah, the allegiance of what was, the Democrats are not today what they were 40 years ago.
I think that's happening all over the world.
Well, look at Labour here. And Labour today is not a reflection of what it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. It is very, very different. We're seeing the same thing. Some of these people hopping over then too.
Let's add something else. Let's add something else into this.
Can I get a...
Go on.
Sorry. Looking at it from another point of view, and this applies to most of Europe as well as the United States, what we've had over the last 40 or 50 years is the so-called left-wing parties becoming right-wing or centre-right or whatever, and leaving behind the working class. Working class people don't like that. Now, the idea that a Trump, whose great contribution to the economy is cutting taxes for very rich people, is somebody that working class people should be voting for, is disgusting.
But he's convinced them that he's right.
It's true. It worked.
I think the Democrats started it by saying, "We don't really care about you for 40 or 50 years." That gave Trump, and not only Trump, it's been that since Reagan there. So, but the one good thing that is happening, but it may not happen quickly enough, is that Bernard and the progressives in the Democratic Party and around the Democratic Party have more power now than they have had for decades. And their policies, which they say, no, cut out all this nonsense, this hatred. We want good housing. We want a good minimum wage. We want good health care. That may fail because the bulk of the media are what the bulk of the media are. But if it fails, then we're into a disaster because it does mean that Trump's and his successors will win.
That was me thinking the bulk of the media in America were liberal.
Well, if you think that media owned by billionaires is likely to be liberal in any meaningful sense, then you're right.
Well, Tom, you can answer. You've represented ABC in this country, but a lot of the major networks, I'd say their political, their news coverage, is basically liberal.
I guess you can call it liberal, but I mean, what by definition is, Larry points out, the Democratic Party today, is it liberal?
Well,
the Democratic machine, is that liberal? It's not liberal.
It's not conservative, though.
It's not conservative.
So what is it?
It might be corporate. Maybe we need a new term for it. The old labels do not apply in 2024. It's very, very also a phenomenon I find absolutely interesting, and I'm watching it closely because, we grew up for years knowing the power of sort of like the tabloids in this country 40 years ago and the influence in elections. The influence of the networks in America 40 years ago, important. We've got this guy, Joe Rogan now, 30 million views this guy has. And we kind of ignore it because it's one of those things on your computers. These are the things that you really have to take notice of today. And a lot of us oldsters certainly we're learning. But I guess the youngsters are really hip to this, and they know that is where the future lies with regard to influencing
the Tom
politics.
Rivers podcast, I would listen to that.
Let's do one.
Yeah?
Okay, let's do one.
Me and Tom.
I got time.
Right, let's move on to some more questions in just a moment. It's 8:45.
They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets.
America Decides on LBC.
Do we believe in the promise of America?
I don't have a lot of respect for her, and I think she'll be a terrible president.
He's been one of the most polarizing figures in recent history.
We're going to have the largest deportation in the history of our country.
Will it be the return of President Trump?
Joe Biden became mentally impaired. Kamala was born that way.
I will proudly put my record against his.
Or will Vice President Kamala Harris claim the White House?
We are not a vessel for the schemes of wannabe dictators.
Join me, Sheila Fogarty and John Sopel from 10 tonight as America Decides.
Kamala, you're fired.
Stay with us for the best analysis throughout the night.
And as results continue to come in, join me, Nick Ferrari, live from 5 a.m. in Washington, D.C.
America Decides. Tonight from 10 p.m. This is LBC.
Meet the
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49. Jeff says, truth be told, I had real election fatigue, what with our election here and the American one. And just lately, I've been switching the radio off when the topic is covered. But your panel and discussions have got me absolutely captivated. And I've put anything I was going to do this evening on hold until the end of the show. A really great panel and a credit to your show. Thank you so much. That's Jeff in Aylesbury. Well, that's a nice one, isn't it?
Take it.
So you've earned your thousands of pounds.
Else I've heard tonight.
Right, well, you have with us Larry Sanders, Greg Swenson, Elisabeth Braw and Tom Rivers. A text question from Bernie in Tower Hamlets, not that one. Do the Democrats have a democracy problem when you look at how they removed Bernie Sanders from the primaries in 2016 and shunted Joe Biden from their ticket this summer? Larry?
Well, do they have a democracy problem? The United States has a democracy problem. They didn't remove Bernie from the primaries. They opposed him. They fought him tooth and nail, and they made a terrible mistake and chose the person who was going to lose the election. Shunting Joe Biden from the ticket this summer, I think, is just a sense if he'd been ill or if he'd whatever. You expect that person not to run for president, and I think Biden, looking at his performances, was not well. Whether it was what he was suffering from, I don't know. So I think that was quite a legitimate thing, and there is a system for the party nominating people. But the Democratic Party, may I say, I grew up in New York. The Democratic Party has a long history of not being very democratic.
Well, at least you didn't grow up in Chicago, eh? Tom?
Bernie was in the driver's seat until, Super Tuesday, as I recall. But I don't know. I guess, you think back, too. Many people on the inside track were now reporting this, but again, we'd heard it from the White House press spokesman that Joe, up until, 6-7 months ago, was sharp as a tack. And all of a sudden, turning on a dime, gosh, he's not as sharp as a tack anymore. And people could see how he was interacting with people. Think back to the G7 in Italy, some of his other trips to the Vatican, et cetera, et cetera. Something was wrong there. It didn't just happen a couple of months ago.
Okay, Greg?
Yeah, I think they definitely have a problem. I mean, if you look back, to Bernie in 2020, I mean, even the superdelegates in 2016 that kept Hillary afloat, but more in 2020 when, remember, Biden came in 4th in Iowa and 5th in New Hampshire. They took Bernie out back. I mean, it was really cruel. I thought when they convinced, the other candidates to step aside, maybe promised them a few cabinet positions or whatever. It really was unfair to Bernie. Maybe that's why 15% of Bernie voters voted for Trump. And that's 2016. I don't know what the number was in 20. So I do think they have a problem. I mean, remember, and what they did this time around, Dean Phillips, legitimate congressman from Minnesota running for president, he saw and articulated the cognitive issues that Joe Biden was having in a really nice way, in a polite way. And they kept him off the ballot. He was not on the ballot in North Carolina and Florida. It's pretty outrageous for the party that says, we're about democracy and Trump's a threat to democracy. And then they just violated every democratic norm in the process. And then the reason it wasn't the cognitive challenges, because they knew about that, right? They knew about it for 9 months. They might have known about it for 4 years. It's when Trump started polling up 5 points over him. And that's why they got rid of Bernie, because Bernie was down 10 points in the polls to Trump in February, before COVID, in February of 2020. That's why they got rid of Bernie. That's why they did the Bernie treatment to Joe. And that's why we have Kamala, who's never earned a vote. And she's a failed candidate, never got over 2% of the vote. She was a horrible candidate. She was polling 7 in South Carolina. It was crazy.
Elizabeth, I'm going to give you an option to opt out of this one if you'd like, and we can move on to the next question.
I'll opt in and add something to what Larry was saying earlier about the Democrats' move away from the working class. It's not just the Democrats, and not just Labour in the UK. We have seen the left, centre-left in Germany, for example, do the same thing. And along comes somebody, in this case, Sarah Wagenknecht, who formed a new party party called BSW, as in W, Sarah Wagenknecht, her initials, who formed a party designed to appeal to these ordinary voters, the working class. And lo and behold, it does extremely well in the first elections it ever participates in, which is a number of state elections that have taken place just recently. I will never understand why centre-left parties in recent years have left their traditional voters to others to pick up. How can that be? I mean, why would you
Because they're run by metropolitan elites, that's why. Simple as that, who have no comprehension what working class people do, say, think. That's basically the problem.
And on that note, credit to Bernie Sanders for standing up for these traditional left-wing voters, centre-left voters, in election after election.
I want to introduce one more question. It's from Sandra in Portsmouth. Should elected UK politicians be getting involved in the US election? Now, Nigel Farage is in the US and has visited Trump at his home in Florida, while Trump gave a shout-out to him during a rally in Pennsylvania yesterday. You had Dawn Butler, the Labour MP, urging people to vote for Donald Trump. But tonight, I'm led to understand that the Labour Party has issued an edict to all of their members of Parliament not to comment on the US election overnight. Make of that what you will. Tom?
For years and years we've seen, parties in, the Labour Party.
Sorry, just before you go on, apparently I said she urged people to vote for Trump. I meant against Trump, obviously.
Yes. Okay. We saw representatives from the Labour going over to the Democrats and strategizing, et cetera, and the cross current the other way with Republicans helping out conservatives, et cetera. This time around, it seems like just the numbers kind of got to me, I guess, in the neighborhood of 100 Labour supporters going over to America. It just seems like a large number. And again, there's no limit on the number, but it seems like that's a different ballgame this time around with regard to the strategy of the Labour Party going to America.
Larry?
Well, I have to say what concerns me about this is very specifically Farage, because we're talking about the demise or the reduction of the left-leaning parties. Which has happened in Britain and which is being pushed to a new extreme by Starmer. Farage's party, which is a far-right party, basically, got 15% of the vote in the last election without much of anything. Farage is a menace. He joins the people in Germany and in Austria and in Poland and in France and in Italy. We're facing a really disastrous problem with climate change completely upsetting the entire world. With these people coming to the fore, well, we probably haven't done very well for our children and grandchildren.
But parties like Farage's parties are only becoming popular because the mainstream parties have let down many of the very people that are voting.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think that's what I was trying to say. They have done that. And I don't think they've done it out of, as you were saying, out of ignorance of what people are thinking about. I think it's more sinister than that. There is a lot of money in politics. Blair is a very rich man today. Clement Attlee didn't become a very rich man when he stopped being prime minister. There is a world in which people, and we tend to think, this is the private world, the business world, and this is the government world. Increasingly what you see is one world. The same people are running both worlds.
So, Elisabeth, globalisation it's still working, isn't it? From that point of view.
From that point of view, but from a corporate point of view, companies are struggling mightily because it's not a good idea to be trying to increase your business in China, and especially not in Russia anymore. It's not one globe. It may feel like one globe to a certain elite, but countries are not getting along anymore. And can I just add, regarding UK activists travelling to the US to help campaign, they probably feel good doing it, but it's not going to influence the outcome of the election. And it's more an opportunity, as has turned out to be the case, more of an opportunity for somebody to get upset and complain about them being there, rather than, as Trump has done with those labor activists, rather than them helping the Democrats gain anything at all.
Craig?
Yeah, I think the 100 labor volunteers, there's nothing wrong with it. We've been doing it for, both parties doing it for generations. Maybe bad timing, bad optics. Keir and David Lammy are trying to kiss and make up with Trump, so maybe it wasn't perfectly timed, but no big deal. And I think as long as the volunteers are supporting my candidate, then I'm all for it. I really don't care.
Think back real quick, guys. When Barack came over right before the Brexit vote, and you British kind of thumbed your nose at him, saying, go back home. We got our own ideas that we're working on over here. So, yes, you're absolutely right. I don't think foreigners coming over into a different country are not going to hold much sway.
And thanks to our panel of 4 foreigners this evening. Now,
really good point.
And our fun question for the end of the programme is from Oliver in Cambridge. From Trump-branded gold shoes to Harris-branded friendship bracelets, there's been lots of campaign merch available during this election. If you could launch one piece of branded clothing as part of a campaign or movement you were running, what would it be and why? Greg?
Oh, definitely a tie, probably from Vineyard Vines, because it's more of a weekend thing with the little initials, GRS, very small ones, so you have to really look at it. It's like the little dogs and the little elephants or whatever. Perfect.
Okay. Elisabeth?
A face mask. Everybody will see it, and we are going to have another pandemic.
I actually have Iain Dale and Jackie Smith branded face masks for our For the Many podcast, which I still have a plentiful supply of.
You should run for office.
No, that's been there, done that. Got the T-shirt. Larry?
Well, I suppose I'll have to go with Bernie's gloves. I was astonished. He sits down in an outdoor meeting with a coat and gloves on. Somebody takes a photograph of it, and it's seen as so extraordinary that anybody should just wear a coat and gloves in cold weather, that it goes around the world. I don't know, maybe hundreds of millions of memes or whatever they call them.
So glove manufacturers were very pleased.
In my neighborhood in Washington, somebody had a life-size cutout of Bernie Sanders in those gloves in his window.
Well,
there you go. Baseball cap. Some people have never seen me without a beat. You guys are very lucky.
I saw when you arrived, you had one on.
You guys are lucky. I'm
surprised you haven't got it on now.
For 47 years, I've lived with headphones on, so I decided to take it off today. And, there's some people who are surprised that I have hair. There you go.
Right, well, thank you all very much indeed. Tomorrow's panel consists of Dr. Jan Halper-Hayes, who was part of Donald Trump's 2016 transition team, the playwright and author Bonnie Greer, the journalist and broadcaster Lionel Barber, plus the former Obama digital strategist Matthew McGregor. So they'll be here for Cross Question tomorrow. And by then, we might know who the next president is going to be, or, ladies and gentlemen, we might not. Thank you to all 4 of you for coming in this evening.
Thanks, Ian.
Now, we're going to continue the conversation over the next hour, leading up to our overnight extravaganza with Sheila Fogarty and John Sopel. So I'm just going to ask you, if you have a vote in the American election, how have you cast it and why? If you'd like to have had a vote, again, the same question. And I'd particularly like to get on as many Americans as possible in this hour, whether you live in the UK or whether you are listening in the United States. The number to call 0345 6060